I planned in my sermon today to talk about where in our daily, mundane lives we can connect with the sacred and source holiness and remind ourselves of the vast, stunning story that is our existence on any given day. It was supposed to be an invitation to look around you and to notice the sacred and unlikely places. I wanted to talk about what makes our lives hard, and how practices of noticing and shared experience, like going to baseball games and cheering with bleachers full of strangers for good plays made by people we've never met. They might score runs against other people we've never met, but that are apparently less important to us than the ones in the uniforms we have decided are ours. Might help us to reconnect with ourselves and one another. Might help us to get through the flat tires. That was my week. Sleepless nights, and the whining of dogs, and I wrote children, but really, let's say people, because frankly, I'm an adult who whines. I do not exempt myself from that charge. I was going to come to church and talk about how meaning-making is an orientation, not a thing that happens in particular buildings or on particular days like Sunday mornings, say. It turns out that Floridian politicians didn't like that message, as I found out on Wednesday. Because as much as I believe that the extraordinary actions of our Martha's Vineyard residents over the past few days says something important about our community as a whole, I also need to name that I believe that our efforts were only successful because of the powerful scaffold of religion-generated initiatives onto which those efforts could be layered. I came to understand that what I needed most to say today was not that you might deepen your spiritual lives through day-to-day spiritual practices disconnected from spiritual communities, but the exact opposite. That spiritual communities, churches and synagogues and mosques and ashrams and gurdwaras and sanghas matter more than ever. I'm going to give you a side note here. For the remainder of my message today, I will be using the word church or spiritual or religious community as a stand-in word for all of those organizing entities that I just named. So please know that when I say church, I am not intending to discount other forms of religious community that don't use that word to describe themselves. At any rate, here is an odd little thing about my message flip. I discovered that I actually didn't need to change much about my order of service and the hymn selection that I sent to Anna on Tuesday to hold up the message that was found on the other side of the coin. Belonging, it seems, can be learned in one place and applied in the other. Do you need church? I do. But then again, I'm fairly certain I'm paid to say that. Be suspicious. But we need church. Our society at large needs church. The precipitous decline of church attendance over the last several years, a decline that when placed in graph form looks like the rapid erosion of an ocean bluff, raises alarm among religious professionals, not because of our livelihoods, but because we know that church communities offer something unique and necessary, and as they disappear, we have not replaced them with alternatives. Ironically, arguments for the cutting of state and national social support programs have often relied on statements that say, the state doesn't need to provide this support because churches do. So you watch federal funds go down and church support go down at the same time. Churches need to provide this support. Churches do provide this support, they say. They do. They try to still, despite declining numbers and the intended decline in volunteers and financial resources and overall community strength. We are calling all angels because we are losing precious knowledge for how this goes. When Wednesday's media-motivated stunt deposited 50 confused and hungry and tired and hurting refugees at the door of community services, Marjorie Pierce from the West Tisbury Congregational Church was in the church kitchen cooking 2 enormous pots of soup, one vegan, one meat-based, using produce from the island gleaning program that she's also heavily involved in. She was intending to freeze her efforts because she does that all summer in preparation for the nightly community suppers that are held at different island churches in the off-season. Instead, those 2 pots of pea soup got thrown into her car and brought down to St. Andrews. I said in one conversation with a reporter that despite being surprised, we were ready. We had soup on the stove before we knew it would be needed. We were ready because of church-based programs. Father Chip from St. Andrews was out of town, but that church is the most pivotal one in our Island Night Shelter program, scheduled to open up its doors at least 4 out of 7 nights each week during our coldest months. In conjunction with staffing through Harbor Homes, that program in our area, churches provide a warm shelter and bed for people experiencing homelessness. Because there isn't such a thing in the secular community on the vineyard. There wasn't such a thing at all until the last 8 years. We need religious community. And not just because of the pragmatic short-term housing and feeding and warm clothing demands that religious communities have sought to fill. We also need religious community because it helps bring our evolved to be social human beings into states of healthy belonging, true belonging. The kind that helps us understand that our relationship is to the interdependent web of all existence, the web that tugs on us when we let ourselves awaken to it. It requires us to release fear as a motivating force in our lives. There are certainly people who seek belonging through the construction of communities of fear. In-group mentality that says fear the stranger, fear difference, communities animated by fear. They are the I'm grateful for water. They are the malignant growths within American religious history. Personally, I'm not sure that living with elevated adrenaline as a general rule sounds all that appealing. But I know that some people thrive on a sense of certainty, and dividing ourselves into us and them does provide a convenient enemy. But if we're not going to live in a state of permanent agitation and fear, then we're going to have to operate on a 2 huge pots of soup on the stove at the ready mentality. It's an invitation to vulnerability, readiness, and expectation that at some point feeding will be necessary. And it may be us. And so it is that on Wednesday, in the words of one of the Venezuelan refugees who unexpectedly found themselves on an island off the coast of Massachusetts that has variously been described as 2, 4, and 27 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, this group experienced un golpe de buena suerte, a stroke of good luck. To land in a place that has such strong networks of caretaking, primarily, but not solely, centered around our religious communities, provided an antidote to the cruelty with which they had been treated. A cruelty that was designed and implemented by someone who claims strong religious identity himself. Historian Lynn White Jr. has said that since the roots of our troubles are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. As Timothy Beale rephrases that sentiment, if religion has got us into this mess, religion has to be part of the way out. In Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, this wild and fantastical novel that was published several years ago by Susanna Clarke, she tells this story that, as summarized by Mike Cosper, is about the rediscovery of magic in England in the 19th century. In the beginning of the tale, magic has vanished from England. It remains part of English folklore, like the story of King Arthur, but no one has actually practiced it in many years. Nonetheless, there were men who called themselves magicians, They did so in spite of the fact that not one of these magicians had ever cast the smallest spell, nor by magic caused one leaf to tremble upon a tree, made one mote of dust to alter its course, or changed a single hair upon anyone's head. But with this one minor reservation, they enjoyed a reputation as some of the wisest and most magical gentlemen in Yorkshire. These magicians spent their days in lengthy arguments about theoretical magic, debating the use of this spell over that, and nitpicking the details of magic's history in England, and meeting once a month and reading long, dull papers to one another. The idea of actually practicing magic was vulgar. And then Mr. Norrell showed up, and he cast a spell that made all of the statues in Yorkshire's cathedral come to life, shouting and singing and telling stories about their deaths, the deaths of the men and the women whose images they bore. The magicians of Yorkshire were speechless. The world was far different than they'd believed. Can you see in the religious landscape of America something akin to the theoretical magicians of Yorkshire? This is the chasm between knowing of and knowing how, between believing something and practicing it, between understanding the importance of hospitality or belonging and putting that understanding into action. If you read Hebrew or Christian scripture, you encounter a world animated by action, by prophets who do the work of prophecy, by stories of God actively engaging with this world. And these scriptures describe miracles and healing and encounters with the sacred. Where, you might ask, are all these miracles, these encounters with the sacred now? Calling all angels. If you are someone who looks to the scripture as a tool in making meaning in your own life, here, now, in the 21st century, you're probably challenged by the hypocrisies that you see around you. Widespread behaviors among the supposedly devout that are clearly found in both Christian and Jewish scripture under the headings, "Do not do this." Leaving aside all of the right-wing Christian nationalist cause célèbre that aren't even referenced in Jewish and Christian scripture. These scriptures, we know, speak of loving the stranger and caring for the least of these and feeding the hungry and offering compassion and inviting people to live lives of fullness and growth and vulnerability. Longing after life that we might grow our own sense of belonging, even as we invite others through our actions, not just our words, into a place of belonging themselves. In America right now, we have our own magicians of Yorkshire, behaving as though they understand magic. They are the keepers of the tradition of magic, while also behaving as though there is no more practical magic in the world. It is not surprising, because it has always been harder to practice our faith, to live consistent with our values, than to talk about it in safe and siloed spaces. For every Greta Thunberg or Rosa Parks, we have thousands who either move through the world with a sneaking sense of shame that they aren't doing enough in the service of their beliefs, or worse, that they don't feel any shame at all when they publicly proclaim a faith and then take actions or create laws or abuse their power in ways that undercut the most animating features of that faith on a regular basis. We don't live in a world of many hundred-year-old biblical patriarchs and bringing the dead back to life. We know that world never existed. They've always and ever been metaphors for how we might endeavor to live in community and treat our fellow creatures and connect ourselves to something beautiful and scary and life-giving and as mysterious as trees evolving alongside us, that they might take our poisonous carbon dioxide exhalations and turn them into something life-giving. We can do that same thing. Take something noxious and make it beautiful. Practical magic starts with noticing. Noticing suffering, noticing beauty, noticing who is present, noticing who is missing. It's invisible unless we endeavor to name it. It's about healing what is broken and showing up when called. Practical magic is evident in religious communities when they truly live their faith and their values all over the country. Theoretical magic shows up in grandstanding preachers who tell you that they know more than you do about how you ought to live your life. Practical magic is about deepening our longing for life and life-sustaining practices. That in the end, all who seek to join us in this longing after life might be welcomed not just by our words, but by our practices. I got sucked into a Facebook argument about this. I hope I'm the only one, but I sense that I am not. And I wrote a response to a post yesterday about how important it was to recognize that the refugees who were lied to and lured onto planes through deception had not believed that they were headed to a small island 3 or 7 or 24 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. I sought to remind our detractors that demanding that people who have been brought to our island against their will should remain here so that they can prove our hospitality is as bad as the stunt that resulted in their arrival. I was inviting us to think like actual magicians, not just the theoretical ones, who may call themselves magicians, but get our understanding of magic only through dusty books or incensed and wildly inaccurate social media posts. Actual magicians, like the ones in our community who showed up this week to do the work of magic, to create something beautiful out of something cruel. I described my hopes for more humane immigration practices, and I ended it this way. But first, let us treat these immigrants with dignity and humanity, and as real people who have goals and hopes that sadly often start with simply seeking more safety than they could count on at home. Let's ask them, because to ask is to value their human agency. Where do you want to go? Where do you have family? Who is waiting for you? How can we help you get there? And then I realized that my message for today might actually grow out of those answers to those questions, directed compassionately at ourselves, and out of the magic that we seek to harness through strong, sustainable, and soul-growing and life-altering, multi-generational spiritual community. Where do we want to go as a community? Where or who is the church family that we want to claim, that is willing to claim us, that is waiting for our arrival? How can we at UUSMV help one another to get there, to get to where we need to go, to get to a place of meaningful personal and community growth, not in numbers, but in deepening, belonging, that we might move away from a theoretical magic into a practical magic that is a coming to life, a shouting for justice, and a singing to lift our souls and convey deep wisdom without words, telling our stories and listening to one another tell theirs. No longer frozen statues clinging to the values that we may hold but fail to animate, but people willing to put our beliefs into action, because we know that the magic that arises out of our actions is in fact the most powerful belonging there is. May it be so. Amen.